The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, delivered not by the usual postboy, but by a solicitor's clerk who had ridden from London through the night and would not leave the doorstep of Bramwell Hall until he had placed the envelope directly into the hands of the one person named upon it. It was sealed in black wax, pressed with the mark of a legal firm that had not corresponded with that household in 19 years, and the footman who answered the door that morning stood frozen for a long moment, uncertain whether such a letter, addressed as it was, ought to be carried up to the Duke at all, or carried instead to the small, plain room at the end of the east corridor where the family's poor relation had lived, quietly and almost invisibly, for the better part of a decade. He carried it to the poor relation, and by the time the Duke came down to his breakfast that morning, unaware that anything at all had changed beneath his own roof, the woman he had spent 3 years dismissing as a burden upon his charity was sitting alone beside a cold window with that letter open in her lap, and the whole of Bramwell Hall's future, though none of them yet knew it, had already begun to shift beneath their feet. But to understand what that letter meant, we must return to where it all began, to a wet stretch of low, forgotten ground at the edge of the estate, and to 11 careless words the Duke spoke over dinner 3 years before, words he was certain no one of any consequence would remember. Before we return to that evening, may I ask something of you? If stories like this one draw you in, stories of quiet women dismissed by powerful men who rise not through anger but through patience, intelligence, and quiet defiance, I would ask you to subscribe now so you never miss the next chapter we tell. And I would love to know, in the comments below, where in the world you are watching from tonight. I read every single comment, and it always moves me to see how far these old stories travel. Now, let us go back to Thornmere Fen, and to the woman the Harlow family never thought to look at twice. Her name was Grace Harlow, and she was, by the strict accounting of blood, and Harlow as legitimate as any of them, though the household had long ago stopped treating her as such. Her father, Thomas Harlow, had been the younger brother of the current Duke, Percival Harlow, 7th of that name, and in his youth Thomas had been the gentler of the two brothers, more given to walking the low fields at the estate's edge than to sitting in drawing rooms discussing rents and reputations. He had, in his 26th year, done the one thing his family could never forgive. He had married a schoolmaster's daughter from the village, a clever, plainly dressed young woman named Margaret Ainsley, for no reason the old Duke, their father, could accept beyond the fact that Thomas loved her. He had been disinherited within the year, his name struck quietly from the family's correspondence, his portrait taken down from the long gallery and never rehung. Thomas and Margaret had lived modestly in a small cottage some 20 miles from Bramwell, raising their only daughter Grace on very little money but a great deal of tenderness, until a fever took them both within the same terrible fortnight when Grace was 19 years old, leaving her with no fortune, no protector, and no choice but to write, with great reluctance, to the uncle who had never once acknowledged her existence. The Duke had taken her in, not out of warmth, but out of the same cold sense of duty that governed every other decision in his life. A Harlow, however diminished, could not be permitted to fall into visible poverty and bring talk upon the family name. Grace was given a small room in the east wing, a modest allowance, and a place at the family table that everyone understood, without it ever needing to be said aloud, was granted on sufferance rather than welcome. It was on a cold evening in her 3rd year beneath that roof that Grace first heard the words that would, though she did not know it then, come to define the whole of the years that followed. The Duke's land agent, a narrow, careful man named Mr. Silas Crane, had come to dinner that evening with his usual report on the estate's holdings, and had arrived, near the end of his accounting, at the matter of a low, waterlogged stretch of ground at the eastern boundary of the estate, known locally as Thornmere Fen. Some 400 acres of reed and standing water that had never, within living memory, returned the estate a single shilling of profit. The fen continues to cost more in drainage attempts than it could ever return, Your Grace, Mr. Crane said, in the flat, rehearsed voice of a man who had delivered this same report for years. I would recommend, once again, that further investment there be abandoned entirely. The Duke did not so much as glance up from his plate. That land will never turn a profit, he said, with the same bored finality he applied to every subject he considered beneath serious thought. It never has, and I dare say it never shall. My father wasted good money trying to drain it 40 years ago, and I shan't repeat his mistake. Let it lie fallow, and be done with it. Lord Julian Harlow, the Duke's son and heir, seated near his father, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his place in the world, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile at those words, a smile Grace happened to notice, seated as she always was at the far dim end of the table, and one she would remember, with a slow and growing unease, for a very long time afterward. No one at that table thought to ask Grace what she thought of the fen, or of anything else. It had not occurred to a single one of them that she might think of it at all. And yet Grace, hearing her uncle dismiss that land so completely, felt something stir in her that she could not entirely explain. For she remembered, faintly, from a childhood she had almost forgotten, her own father speaking once, in a quiet and wistful voice, of a piece of low ground near his boyhood home that he had always believed could be made to bloom if only someone had the patience to try. She did not know then that her father had meant that very fen. She did not know that Thomas Harlow had spent the last summer before his disinheritance walking those 400 acres with a surveyor's chain and a notebook full of careful drawings, convinced that beneath the standing water lay some of the richest black soil in the county. She did not know that his plans for draining and reclaiming that land had once sat upon his own father's desk. Approved and nearly funded before his marriage to a schoolmaster's daughter had ended, in a single stroke, both his inheritance and his hopes for Thornmere Fen together. All of that still lay hidden from her, sealed away in places she had not yet thought to look. But something about her uncle's careless words that evening would not let her rest, and that restlessness, small and quiet as it was, marked the beginning of everything that followed. She began, in the weeks after that dinner, to walk to the fen herself, telling the household only that she found the exercise good for her nerves, which was true, though far from the whole truth. The fen in late autumn was a bleak, beautiful place, flat grey water threaded with reeds, herons standing motionless in the mist, the ruin of an old drainage sluice half collapsed into the mud at its northern edge, built, she would later learn, during her own father's brief and thwarted attempt at reclamation decades before. She found, walking its edges, an old stone marker half buried in the reeds, carved with initials she did not yet recognize as her father's own, and something in the sight of it settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, a feeling she could not name, but could not shake either. It was in the disused library of the East Wing, some weeks later, searching for nothing in particular beyond a way to occupy the long, grey hours of a widow's life she had never actually had the chance to live, that Grace found the first true thread that would unravel everything. Tucked behind a row of estate histories no one had opened in a generation, wrapped in a length of faded green ribbon, she found a bundle of old letters and a slim, water-stained notebook bearing, on its first page, in a careful, familiar hand, the name Thomas Harlow. She did not know then that the notebook she held contained her father's full survey of Thornmere Fen, his measurements, his soil samples, his detailed and confident argument that the fen's black earth, once properly drained, would rival the richest market garden soil in the county. She did not know that the letters bundled alongside it were correspondence between her father and his own father. The old Duke, discussing the very funding for that drainage scheme that had, in the final letter of the bundle, been abruptly and coldly withdrawn, Not, as she had always been told, because the scheme was foolish, but because, as the old Duke's own hand had written, a son who marries beneath his station forfeits, along with his name, whatever schemes he brought to this family's table. Her father had not been wrong about the land. He had been punished, and the land had been punished alongside him, left to rot in the water for 40 years, simply so that no one would ever have to admit that Thomas Harlowe's judgment had been sound. Reading those pages by candlelight, Grace felt grief and anger move through her in equal measure, and beneath both of them, something new and unfamiliar began to take shape, a quiet, stubborn resolve that she would not allow her father's forgotten work to remain buried in a library no one visited, in a family that had erased him twice already, first from its portraits, and then from its memory. She did not go to the Duke with what she had found. She had learned enough, in her years beneath that roof, to know that a woman with no fortune and no standing, bringing 40-year-old accusations against the family that sheltered her, would be thanked with nothing but a swifter path back to genuine poverty. Instead, she did what her father had once done, and did it quietly, alone, and without a single soul in that household aware of it. She began, herself, to drain the fen. She used what remained of her small personal allowance, hoarded carefully over years of modest living, to hire 2 of the estate's tenant farmers during the slow winter months, men who remembered her father kindly and asked no questions when she showed them his old survey and asked, simply, whether they believed his measurements could still be trusted. They did. Using Thomas Harlowe's 40-year-old plans as their guide, they began, through that long winter, to clear and repair the old sluice at the fen's northern edge, opening, inch by careful inch, a channel that had sat choked with silt since before Grace was born. No one in the household noticed. Julian assumed, on the rare occasions he thought of his cousin at all, that she occupied herself with letters and needlework, as poor relations were generally expected to do. The Duke did not think of her in any capacity whatsoever. And Grace, walking each morning to a stretch of ground everyone else had agreed was worthless, found in that quiet, muddy labour something she had not felt since her parents' deaths, the sense of continuing something that mattered, rather than simply enduring a life that had been handed to her by other people's decisions. By the second spring, the water at the fen's centre had receded enough to reveal soil so dark and rich that even the tenant farmers, who had worked that county's land their whole lives, remarked they had never seen its like. Grace planted, that first proper season, a modest crop of market vegetables and a stand of willow for basket weaving, on land that had officially, in every ledger at Bramwell Hall, produced nothing at all for 4 decades. She did not know then that Silas Crane, riding the estate boundary that same spring on his usual rounds, had noticed the changed colour of the fen from a distance, and had said nothing to the Duke, choosing instead to make a quiet note of it in his own private book, for reasons that would not become clear to Grace until very much later. The 2nd and 3rd years brought Thornmere Fen fully to life, and they brought, alongside it, a transformation in Grace that the household could not help but notice, even as they failed entirely to understand its cause. She sold that first season's modest harvest, not through the estate's usual channels, but through a corn factor in the nearby market town who had no history with the Harlowe name and no reason to offer anything but a fair price, precisely as her father, in his notebook, had once advised any future steward of that land to do. The following year she expanded the drained acreage, planted a full rotation of vegetables and fodder crops recommended in her father's careful notes, and began, quietly, to keep her own accounts, in a plain ledger locked inside a small trunk in her room, because some instinct she could not entirely explain warned her that the moment her success became visible, someone in that household would move quickly to claim it as their own. That instinct, though she did not yet know it, was entirely correct. It was in the autumn of the third year, as Thornmere Fen's harvest was gathered in fuller and richer than even Grace had dared to hope, that she discovered, quite by accident, the second half of the truth her father's notebook had only begun to suggest. She had gone to the County Land Registry Office in the market town to make a small, cautious inquiry about formally recording her tenancy of the fen, believing, in her innocence, that no one would object to a piece of ground everyone agreed was worthless being put to some quiet use. The clerk who assisted her, an elderly and precise man who had served that office for 30 years, informed her, with some confusion, that the parcel in question could not be recorded to her because it was not, and had never been, part of the entailed Harlow estate at all. Thornmere Fen, the clerk explained, consulting a deed so old its ink had begun to fade, had been purchased outright by Thomas Harlow himself, in his own name, in the year before his marriage. A private holding entirely separate from his family's entailed lands, and one which, upon his death, ought to have passed directly and solely to his only child. It had never passed to her. Somewhere in the confusion following her parents' sudden deaths, when Grace was 19 and grieving and entirely unfamiliar with matters of law, the deed to Thornmere Fen had been quietly folded into the general administration of the Harlow estate by the very solicitors the old Duke had engaged to handle his brother's modest affairs. Solicitors who, the clerk noted, consulting his records further, had been instructed in that matter not by the court nor by any proper legal authority, but by a private letter from a Mr. Silas Crane, acting, the letter claimed, on behalf of the family. Grace understood, standing in that quiet registry office with the autumn light falling through a dusty window, exactly what she was looking at. Silas Crane had known, 3 years before that dinner, where the Duke had dismissed the fen so carelessly that the land was not truly the estate's to abandon at all. He had known it belonged to Grace alone, and he had spent those years quietly encouraging its neglect, and encouraging Julian's interest in seeing it declared officially worthless and struck from the estate's concerns entirely, for one simple reason, because a piece of land no one valued and no one watched was far easier, eventually, to acquire quietly for himself. Once its rightful owner had been worn down by poverty and obscurity into selling it away for whatever small sum he cared to offer. She did not know then that Crane had already begun, that very autumn, drafting the very offer he intended to make her, certain that a poor relation with no legal knowledge and no allies would sign whatever paper was placed in front of her, grateful simply to be rid of a burden she did not know was actually a fortune. Grace did not sign anything. She left that registry office with a certified copy of her father's original deed folded carefully inside her cloak, and within the week, without a word to anyone at Bramwell Hall, she had engaged a solicitor of her own in London, a careful, thorough man named Mr. Alaric Doyle, who read her father's notebook, her own 3 years of ledgers, and the registry clerk's discovery, with the growing and unmistakable interest of a man who recognised, better than she yet did herself, exactly how much wrong had been quietly done to her. It was Mr. Doyle's letter, sealed with the crest of his old and respected firm, that arrived at Bramwell Hall on that Tuesday morning, carried through the night by his own clerk, because Doyle trusted the contents to no ordinary post. It confirmed, in careful and unambiguous legal language, that Thornmere Fen had never belonged to the Harlow estate at all, that its rightful and sole owner was, and had always been, Miss Grace Harlow, and that the land's redirection into the estate's general holdings some 9 years before had been arranged through documents that Mr. Doyle described, with evident restraint, as irregular in the extreme and very likely fraudulent. Grace read the letter twice, sitting alone by the cold window of her small room, and felt, once again, no triumph in it at all, only a deep and quiet ache for her father, who had loved that muddy, unglamorous stretch of ground more than he had ever loved his own inheritance, and who had died without ever seeing it made whole. She did not rush to confront anyone that day. She waited, instead, until the following Sunday, when the family gathered for its usual formal dinner, and Mr. Crane arrived, as he always did, to deliver his quarterly report. He reached, near the end of his accounting, the matter of Thornmere Fen, and this time, his flat. Rehearsed voice faltered noticeably, because the figure written in his own book, gathered from the discreet inquiries he had been making all that autumn in preparation for his private offer to Grace, showed a harvest value from that supposedly worthless ground exceeding, for the third year running, the entire income of the estate's celebrated home farm combined. "That cannot be correct," Julian said sharply, before his father could speak at all. "That land produces nothing. It never has. It has produced nothing for this estate," Grace said quietly, from her place at the far end of the table, because this estate was never entitled to a single shilling of it. She rose and set before her uncle two documents, her father's 40-year-old survey and Mr. Doyle's letter, still bearing its black wax seal, and did not need to say another word, because the Duke, reading them both by candlelight while his son's face slowly drained of colour beside him, understood at once precisely what Silas Crane had built in the shadows of his own household, precisely what his brother had known and been punished for knowing, and precisely what the quiet, overlooked niece he had sheltered out of nothing but cold duty had accomplished, alone and unnoticed, on ground he himself had declared, 3 years before, incapable of ever turning a profit. What followed at Bramwell Hall was not scandal shouted through the county, though some quiet talk was inevitable, but a slow and careful unwinding of a wrong that had lasted nearly a decade. The Duke, to his credit, did not attempt to shield either his agent or his son from the consequences of what the documents plainly showed. Silas Crane was dismissed within the week, his own private ledgers, once examined by Mr. Doyle, revealing enough irregularity across several of the estate's dealings to end any hope of employment elsewhere in the county. Julian, whose only true offence had been eager silence rather than active fraud, found his father's trust in him diminished in ways far more painful to a proud young man than any public disgrace could have been. And Grace was granted, by formal deed drawn up under Mr. Doyle's careful supervision, undisputed and permanent ownership of the 400 acres her father had loved and lost, along with a quiet, unspoken shift in the way the household regarded her, one that no document could grant, but that her own 3 years of patient, unseen labour had already earned in full. She did not gloat, and she did not need to. She returned to Thornmere Fen the following morning, as she had every morning for 3 years, and stood a long while beside the old stone marker bearing her father's initials, now cleared of the reeds that had once nearly swallowed it entirely. In the years that followed, Thornmere Fen became known throughout the county as some of the finest market garden land in Sussex, its produce sought after in markets 2 counties distant. Its story quietly told and retold among tenant farmers as proof that the old Duke's judgment, however confidently delivered, had been entirely and completely wrong. Grace never sought a grand match, though more than one gentleman who had once overlooked her entirely found her, quite suddenly, worth a second look. She wanted none of their notice. She had already found, in the mud and reeds of a fen everyone else had abandoned, the one thing her father's disinheritance had never truly been able to take from her, proof, complete and undeniable, that patience was not the same as surrender, that being unseen was not the same as being unworthy, and that the ground powerful men are quickest to dismiss is very often the ground with the deepest roots of all. The Duke, in the quiet years that followed, was heard to say, only once, and only to his sister, that the gravest error of his life had been spoken in 11 careless words over an ordinary Sunday dinner, about a piece of land he had been certain would never amount to anything at all. He never repeated those words again. He did not need to. Every season, in the accounts Mr. Kaji, Crane's successor, read aloud at that same long table, the fen answered for him, quietly, patiently, and completely. If this story stayed with you, I would be truly grateful if you would subscribe and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that quiet strength can outlast even the harshest judgment of the powerful. And please, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. I read every one, and I love seeing how far these old stories travel. Thank you for staying with me until the very end.